Hello, welcome to CrossCurrents, produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Barbara Rutstein, the moderator for today's program. Our topic is short-term rentals, how to make them work for all. STRs, VRBOs, Airbnbs are the alphabet soup of newer ways to spend time overnight in Fort Collins, and a way to participate in the current sharing economy. Of course, we have plenty of traditional hotels, motels, and bed and breakfasts where the majority of people still spend the night. But these are different new options. What do these acronyms stand for, and how are they different from one another? What effect do they have on long-term rentals and housing availability in our tight and expensive real estate market? The dilemma is how do we preserve the quality of our neighborhoods without jeopardizing the entrepreneurial spirit of some homeowners and landlords? To discuss this issue, we have on my right Ginny Sawyer, Project and Policy Manager for the City of Fort Collins. On her right is Eric Tamme, a resident homeowner. On his right is Laura Jacobsen, a landlord. And on her right is Gerry Horak, Mayor Pro Tem of the City of Fort Collins. Welcome to all of you and to our studio and viewing audiences. First, let's start with some definitions and clarifications of what I call the alphabet soup. STRs, that's pretty simple, short-term rentals. But what does that imply? Days, weeks, months? Who knows what short-term rentals really mean? Is there a real definition?
I'll just kick this off. From a city perspective and in our tax code, when we talk about short-term lodging, it's 30 days or less. And if you look across the country at a lot of communities that are starting to look at this issue and regulate, typically the number is 29 to 30 days or less.
Okay, anybody else have any other comments on that? So does everybody agree with that?
I think also short-term rentals imply anything under a year-long lease in a lot of other instances too. I mean, the tax code says under 30 days, but there's also a lot of variety of shorter-term rentals that don't go a whole year.
Okay, would that apply to students who have a 9-month rental or?
In the context of our discussion tonight, I think it's 30 days or less. We have not defined short-term rentals in our code right now, which is part of the issue and part of this process going forward. And as we do that, we'll be looking more at a 30-day time frame. But Laura has more experience in the real world of it.
I think that people who rent under a year sometimes rent under 30 days and other times rent over 30 days, but less than a year. It provides a lot of flexibility for the homeowner. So in my case, I looked at 2015 for one of my properties, and I rented it probably 4 or 5 months out of the year on a 30-day or more lease, and the other few months I rented it shorter times. So.
Okay, so there's a variety. Eric, do you have?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that in the context of this argument or discussion, 30 days is generally what people have been talking about, and I think that there certainly are people who rent properties for longer than 30 days. But a lot of the issues that are coming forward as a result of short-term rentals, I think, are due largely to their transient nature. And that specific element is, I think, when you get into things that are 30 days or less, and certainly even shorter, things that are 2-3 days and whatnot. So that's really all I would say.
Okay, now what is VRBO?
VRBO is an online advertising platform where people who rent their homes for shorter periods of time advertise.
Okay, and do you pay to belong to VRBO?
Yeah, to advertise on VRBO, it's a minimum of $380 a year, and the prices go up from there depending on what kind of services you want. The difference in that and Airbnb is also an online platform for advertising short-term, but you don't pay to advertise there. It's free. They get their money from the people who rent.
Okay, the other question that I have about that, are there restrictions with VRBO? Can it be for one night, or is it usually for 5 or more?
There are no restrictions on the advertising platform. A lot of people require at least a 2-night stay. One-night stays don't happen very often in all of my experience. I think my average is 14 nights. I figured that out one day.
Okay, and when you have a VRBO, does that imply that there's a resident manager on the premises?
Actually, a short-term rental does not have a manager on premise. Typically, the manager lives in town. I think we have a few here who are out of state, but most of us are either here or we have a manager, somebody who manages for us here. So these homes are just rented by the person, which is something that makes them different from a hotel. There's not a management office. There's no money being transacted at the property. It's more of a rental.
And it's all taking place online?
Correct.
Okay. Do you have a comment? Yeah.
Yeah, I would just like to say, when you started out talking about alphabet soup, and I think that's very true. But the reality is that a lot of times people refer to these things as a VRBO or an Airbnb, but many of the operators of these list on multiple websites fairly indiscriminately, I think. So the real way that I think that we should be talking about these is what they are, and it's either an owner-occupied short-term rental or it's not an owner-occupied short-term rental. And that's a critical definition that I think we need to differentiate on.
Okay, and that's a question that I have next. What does Airbnb imply or mean? Is that different?
Airbnb, I believe they came up with that name. A couple of college kids were sitting around saying, wouldn't it be great if we could put an air mattress in our room and rent it out to people when they come into town short-term? And so they came up with the name that way. But I'd like to clarify that people use these advertising platforms to advertise a short-term rental for a lot of things besides people coming for vacation. In fact, I just housed somebody who is moving here from North Carolina, bought a house here, but they don't close until March 5th or something. So they're going to be staying in one of my short-term rentals until their house in Fort Collins is ready for them to move into. So the name vacation rental is the name of the website, but it doesn't imply that everybody who rents those places are here vacationing.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, and I would say that's specifically why we should stop referring to them by their platform names, partially because the use is not necessarily reflected by the platform, but also because the properties are listed on many platforms simultaneously, and that they really boil down to an owner-occupied rental or a non-owner-occupied rental.
Okay, Jerry?
Yeah, and as Eric just said, and Laura's brought up, and Ginny said earlier, that basically that's part of our challenge on the city council is to provide the definition, whatever definitions that we like to have. But the terms, the alphabet soup is not the important thing. They're just simply ways for people to find stuff and do it and do the transactions, which is, again, the whole internet economy. The idea of that is making it easy for folks to do stuff without a lot of money having to be exchanged and have some certainty of what you're doing. But so our challenge is again, the tax code says 30 days, but that's not really a definition. That's really the opposite definition. It's really what a lease is versus what the use is. So that's what we're looking at. We've, just to add to that, the council and the VRB, the short-term rental, or whatever we call the right name of Laura and her associates, we have exchanged information. We've gone out and talked with them. Ginny and the staff has done surveys of what's happening around the country in Colorado of these issues. So trying to do a pretty extensive outreach. And just recently, the staff did sent out surveys of those within a certain number of feet of the properties that have been identified to find out pros and cons, what people think about it. So instead of us all giving our perceptions, that we'd actually have some real information. So we've still been gathering information about what to do, and then we'll be having a work session shortly coming up on this. But there's been no decisions made about how we're proceeding forward, except for making sure whichever folks are renting for less than 30 days are paying their appropriate sales and lodging tax.
Okay, we'll get to that. Now, I have some statistics, and I don't know if they're true. Someone on our committee looked this up, and it said that there are 311 VRBOs and 237 Airbnbs listed in the Fort Collins area. That's over 500 listings. Does anybody know if that's correct?
Well, it's probably correct if that's what you found, but the question, I think, is, are they duplicate listings? Some of them are. Are they all inside the city of Fort Collins city limits? Probably not, because what you end up with is very few have addresses. They have some characteristics about where they may be. And so, say if someone's in the zip code, I live in 80521, 80521 goes outside of the city of Fort Collins. So those are issues. If there's hundreds of them, that's probably a correct answer. But if there's 500 of them, I would doubt that.
I think that number might be pretty close to the number of listings, or maybe a little high. But even if it's high, I think that's less than 1% of the total housing stock.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, and I think that it's probably a fairly accurate number. It's difficult to get an actual reading on how many things there are. These platforms are not often cooperative about giving that information to people, but it sounds reasonable. And I know that a lot of times people do say that it's only 1% of our total housing stock, but I think that's not really a relevant argument to make, because when you consider the density of where these are located, it's very much within a small sort of square mile area of surrounding the downtown. So if we were able to get numbers on what's the percentage of homes within 1 mile radius of downtown Fort Collins that are rented as short-term rental, I think that number, the percentage would certainly be significantly higher than 1%.
So we have an idea of the numbers, and we know the definitions. Now let's talk about the real estate part of it. Since 500, or approximately 500 houses may be short-term rentals, how does that affect long-term rentals? Jerry?
Okay, I'll answer that part of the question, but I want to go back to one point, though, you made. If this was a static sort of thing, that the numbers weren't going to change, the issue isn't quite the same. Mm-hmm. But if it's an increasing thing, which is how things have been going, then it is a different issue. So if we have 500 a day or 300 a day or what the right number is, but in 5 years from now, it's 1,000 or 1,500, that's a whole different size problem. So one of the things why we're looking at it is trying to get ahead of this issue for whatever the council and community decides to do, and not wait till it's such a stage that it's nearly impossible to deal with. So I just wanted to add that, sorry.
Right, and that has to do with availability of rental units.
Has to do with availability of rental units, has to do with effects on certain streets. If you have, some communities, for example, have regulations for how many can be on a block face, sort of like the parking issue downtown. You can't park on a block face for 2 hours. If you go back there again, you can't do it. So some communities have it that. Some communities, Nashville, I believe it is, looking at certain areas of town defined by how much can be in that area of town based on census percentages. So people have looked at it in all sorts of ways, and that's some of the information that's being collected by the staff.
Uh-huh. And what about the real estate market? Do we have any idea how that's taking houses out of the sale category and into short-term rentals? Laura, do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I think I made an error on the total number that we've found. Airbnb sent us some documents of theirs that they know they have 200 active hosts. And I believe we've counted up ours, and they were more like around 110. So the number is more like a total of 400. So
Okay.
I'm sorry I got that wrong.
Yeah, that's all right.
I think that the Affordable Housing Commission or Board, whatever it's called, met, and that was October 27th. And they said that because it's less than 1%, it didn't have much of an effect on pricing of houses here. And there was a recent article in the Coloradoan, and I think the pricing of houses here have a lot of variable issues that don't have anything to do with the 0.44% of short-term rentals.
Yes, Eric?
So, yeah, I mean, I think absolutely from an affordable housing perspective, you're probably not going to see an impact on affordable housing. Fort Collins has very little affordable housing to begin with, and it's probably not being used for short-term rentals. That said, I know that the Colorado Division of Housing has sent out reports for the 2013-2014 year that rents have gone up 20%. And our vacancy rates in Fort Collins are overall 1%, and in the downtown area, it's close to 0. And so saying that taking houses off the market or from our stock and having an equal or greater demand for them is not going to increase prices is really contrary to the laws of supply and demand. So I don't think you can make a valid argument that it's not going to affect pricing in some way.
Okay, Jerry?
So various people who facilitate meetings have taught me how to say these things now, which is I agree with both Laura and Eric on this, that right now it's not a significant issue, but simple logic tells you, and economics says, that if you have a good that you could charge more money than a long-term rental lease have the same sort of thing. If we had U plus N, unlimited people, the value of that property as a business changes dramatically, and how much one would bid for that use. The same way, short-term rentals have a higher potential, not saying that Laura and her associates get it, for having more revenue coming in than something that's rented for a year. Therefore, the laws of economics says if I can bid more than somebody else for a house or a property because it's worth more to me.
I just don't want to lose sight of, and the numbers that Laura was talking about. We did make contact with Airbnb, and they sent some basic data sheets, and we don't really get to dig into it. It's just what they provide us, and that is the 200 number. But within that 200 number, they also reported that 55% of those are just renting a room. So it's not a whole house off the market. It's people who, I just want to throw in the side where it can be secondary income for people.
Right, and I read some of the comments that your survey did, and it seemed like some people just rent a room. And do you have any idea, Laura, how many people do that as compared to, let's say, a separate unit completely?
Well, I think on the Airbnb side, it said 50% or so just rent a room of their house, so that would be about 100 of the 200 Airbnb hosts. VRBO is a whole house rental most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those would be just single-family dwellings or condos in a building. But again, I think if everybody who had a whole house dwelling that they're doing short-term couldn't do that for some reason, they wouldn't be selling their properties. They wouldn't become available as an option for people to buy, and the price wouldn't go down that much. There's a misconception that we make way more money doing this than people do when they rent long-term. We make a little bit more money, but we have a lot of expenses that we have to cover to manage a short-term rental. So I actually was able to extrapolate a lot of numbers from this data from Airbnb, and it looks like on average, all the VRBO owners make about $16,000 a year on average, which is about $1,400 a month. Not a whole lot more on that average than a long-term renter.
And I'd just say that I'm not sure that I would, and not to be nitpicky, I just don't know that that's actually statistically valid data. I know that the house that is next to me rents for $1,000 a week.
It might rent for $1,000 a week, but it's not every week.
But it's been booked for every single week from May till November.
Well, I looked at the numbers on how much tax revenue came in from 2015 to the city of Fort Collins for short-term rentals, and I'm pretty sure these are accurate within maybe $10,000 total for a year.
That's assuming that all people are paying taxes, which they're not.
Nope, I did the numbers based on people who did pay taxes.
Right.
And then added what we would make if all people paid taxes who were advertising.
Jerry?
Just a clarification, Larry. So that was gross revenue that individual short-term rental owners get.
That would be gross revenue, not
Okay.
including any
Right.
expenses.
Thanks.
Okay, in general, Laura, what do you think the benefits are for having these kinds of rentals in Fort Collins?
I think that they provide a valuable service to a lot of our people who live here. A lot of families come into town to visit other families that live here, and they want to stay right next to their family. That service, I think it provides a place for people in between homes, like I just talked about, who bought a home and couldn't move in because they hadn't closed yet. It provides the homeowner a lot of flexibility to come in and out of the property and make sure it's well-maintained. A lot of times we put the little bit of extra money we make back into the property, so we're actually making them better and better all the time. It provides resources for seniors who are retired and want to stay in their own home. They can make some extra income, so it provides a way for them to stay there when their income is lower.
I think you've
That's all I
covered
can
a
think
lot.
of right now.
If you can't think of anything else, we get to it. Now, Eric, you see harm in these kinds of rentals. Why don't you
Well,
tell us what you see as
I would
being
actually
harmful?
just wanted to say that there are some things that I think are good about short-term rentals as well. I think that it's true that for bed and breakfast type rentals that are owner occupied, it's certainly a source of income, and I think that that's an argument that lots of people make, and I think that's valid. That said, I think that there are places where these should be operated and places they shouldn't be operated, and I think that having them impacting our residential neighborhoods is really not what they should be doing. I think that there are, we have areas that are designed for operating these types of things, lodging effectively. And I think that we should do a better job of protecting our neighborhoods. So specifically as far as damages are concerned, I mean, talking about the concentration of where these are, there's a map that we've got here, and this is not a statistically super accurate map in that I just went to the Airbnb website and the VRBO website, and they give you more little dots as you zoom in, and this is just close as I could zoom in and get the coverage area that I wanted to see. But you can see here on the map, there's this purple area in the center, and that's downtown, and the areas that are to the left and right of that, which are sort of this light tan and dark tan, those are our, what are called NCM and NCL zoned areas, and that's...
Tell us what that means.
Right, and those are specific zoning areas that are designed to conserve. So NCM is a medium density conservation of our single family residential nature. That's been specified in our city plan, our Old Town plan, specifically to protect these areas. And so you can see that all these green little dots are largely in these areas that are directly surrounding downtown. So it's very much eroding the residential neighborhoods directly surrounding the downtown area. And so it's interesting that talking about the things in terms of an owner-occupied short-term rental and a non-owner-occupied short-term rental, our zoning has definitions which qualify owner-occupied short-term rentals as bed and breakfast. The verbiage is very clear, and I have that if anybody wants to read it, but it's in our city land use code, section 512. And so in the NCL districts, which is a low-density residential area that's supposed to be conserved, bed and breakfasts aren't allowed at all. And they're not allowed in NCM districts without having the Planning and Zoning Board approve them. And so these are operating in locations where things are already supposed to be set up for preservation. So I think that that is a number one thing that is a destructive element of these, is that right now it might not be a huge number of houses, but I think that it's absolutely growing in popularity, and we have to be very cautious about protecting our residential neighborhoods.
And so is there a distinction here between a bed and breakfast and an VRBO?
Well, I would say first and foremost, again, I don't like to use the terms VRBO and Airbnb because they don't accurately reflect what the properties are. Is there a difference between a bed and breakfast, a owner-occupied short-term rental, and a non-owner-occupied short-term rental? And I believe that our land use code defines an owner-occupied short-term rental as a bed and breakfast.
I disagree.
I mean, I have it right here. Bed and breakfast establishment is an establishment operated in a private residence or portion thereof, which provides temporary accommodations to overnight guests for a fee, and which is occupied by the operator of such an establishment. So that's pretty clear. If you live in your property, or the operator of the property, not even living there, and you're renting out any portion of your property for overnight temporary accommodations, it's a bed and breakfast.
Okay.
So our municipal code and the tax code may have slightly different verbiage, but that's not really related to our land use code. And so our land use code is very clear in specifying what these are. We have no definitions whatsoever for what a non-owner occupied short-term rental is. And that's one of the biggest problems here, is that we don't have any way to categorize it in our zoning.
Okay, Laura, what do you have?
So a bed and breakfast is a place that primarily houses groups of unrelated people. So a bed and breakfast will have maybe 5 rooms, and there'll be 5 different people that don't know each other and that are unrelated in it. That's just about a hotel. A residential short-term rental is for a group of related people, a family, or a group of people that know each other. It's not 5 different groups. A bed and breakfast serves breakfast generally. They don't all serve a breakfast, I know that, but short-term rentals don't provide any services that a hotel would, like breakfast or laundry or valet parking. A bed and breakfast collects their money on site. They probably have a business office. A short-term rental does not. They're not the same thing at all.
Okay, so what we really have is a case where the city and the regulations are behind in the times as far as what's going on.
Absolutely.
Is that right, Ginny? Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And again, that's going to be part of our process. And I think, I don't know what year, right, or when we defined bed and breakfast, but obviously we've had some new business models coming in, and so we need to distinguish between them, or not, if that's the decision, but we need to have
Yes.
options for that. As we have brainstormed as staff, we're similar to where Laura is, that bed and breakfast tend to be multi-party rentals. Short-term rentals tend to be single-party rentals. Short-term rentals don't have you wouldn't walk in off the street and have a common space with a lobby, no signage, those kinds of things. So those are some of the potential options for defining differences in the use.
Okay, Jerry, have you had complaints from residents about short-term rentals?
I've had both complaints about them, and I've also had people saying what a wonderful thing it is having them next to them or across the street. So again, there's a varied opinion. If this is an issue the city should be dealing with or not. Again, we're starting from the place of that everybody should pay their sales tax and lodging tax, because clearly it fits that definition. So that's where we're starting from. And as illustrated by the last conversation about definitions of bed and breakfast or short-term rentals, it's clear that we need some work on definitions. So as Jenny said, that's why we're taking a look at this. And again, the reason is to try to get in front of this if it is an issue and make it clear to those who own those types of property what the rules are.
Right, okay. What kind of complaints do you get when you have complaints?
One of the famous was the same one you get for folks who over-occupy long-term rentals. Parking is an issue. The other ones have been not knowing who's staying there is an issue, that if it changes regularly, that the concerns about if the property meets certain basic health and safety codes, are all those things being done? And when I've talked to Laura and her associates, they are for health and safety and things like that. People saying, why is a business being run in my neighborhood? You know, why is that happening? And as well as, where are they? Because right now, we don't really have a way besides folks going through, just as Eric said and others have done, to identify the properties. And so some people have concerns. I would like to know if there's a business in my area, which you would be able to know if a business was being established.
Okay, and what are the rules for an in-home business?
For a home occupation, and I'm going to look at a cheat sheet because not my expertise. Home-based businesses are in a residential zone. There are quite a few criteria. You can't use more than 50% of the home, can't have more than one employee. No retail sales are permitted from the site other than incidental sales. And then possibility of requiring more off-street parking. So those types of things. bed and breakfast facilities are prohibited from that use.
And just
Right.
add to that.
Okay, so you're making a
Right.
distinction between an in-home business and a bed and breakfast.
And also, the home occupancy has to go through a process to receive the right to do it there.
Yes,
And that's part of it, because part of the concern, again, of people in that area would be how many people are coming, are they going to be parking on the street, or you can have lots of activity there, et cetera. So that's why that was done. And to me, again, those are fairly reasonable regulations on home occupancy businesses.
okay, Laura.
So I think as short-term renters, we don't conduct a home occupation or business in whole or in part in a dwelling unit. We do not maintain a real estate office, a business office, or a rental office at the property. The properties are merely used for residential purposes. Courts have ruled on this issue, collecting payment of monies and taxes for short-term rental online and away from the subject property does not constitute a business activity in a dwelling. And I also would like to point out that we have the Fort Collins Rental Housing Standards, which is a thing that's already developed here, that applies to any townhome, condominium, apartment, fraternity, sorority house, hotel, boarding house, or any other livable facility in Fort Collins. There are standards for rentals for safety, everything from windows, fire and carbon monoxide, electricity, heating, et cetera. If there's violations, the city inspectors are authorized to inspect rentals accompanied by the tenant or owner. That applies to short-term rentals and long-term rentals. So I think we have measures in place for dealing with any safety issues. And I also wanted to point out that short-term rentals are not a new concept. I went back to the Coloradoan, back to 1939.
Good work.
There are furnished short-term rentals all over the place in these ads, if anyone cares to see them. Sleeping room, electric plate, $5 per month. That's a house sharing. Furnished 3-room front apartment. So we're not dealing with a new issue, we're just dealing with a new advertising platform.
Okay, Eric,
So-
you
so
had,
just-
oh,
I
go
just
ahead.
want- So on this, I mean, yeah, one can make the argument they've been around forever. I can make the argument hotels and motels have been around forever, but over time, people changed what the rules were. They started to come up with rules, and the reason they started to come up with rules because of health and safety, and everyone doesn't follow the rules. And I was around actually when we did the rental sort of things in the code, which is in the mid-'80s, and we did that and we had people come down here saying, how can you make me put an escape window in for then it was $250, now the cheapest one's $2,000. And of course you can, because you have the perfect right to. The next thing we'll be looking at, as well as for short-term rentals and long-term rentals, is inspection of those properties. And a number of communities do that. They do that and provide ratings, and prospective renters, whether they're short-term or long-term, get to know how those properties are, what kind of quality they are for the concerns that people have for health and safety. And so, again, things change over time, so the platforms came in. That's changed the use of this particular good. It isn't somebody just coming in from a mile away, it's somebody coming in from 2,000 miles away, which changes the whole thing. And the other one is, we'd never be talking about this unless folks had concerns. Some folks have concerns. Our job as a council is to take a look at the issue to see what we should do about it, if anything.
Okay, Eric, I think you had some comments?
Yeah, just really quickly, as far as, there was some specific verbiage that Laura used about operating in a dwelling. And I think that from the non-owner occupied short-term rental perspective, they don't really qualify as dwellings. And the dwelling definition in our land use code, again, says that they cannot be used primarily for temporary occupancy, So I think that you're sort of already disqualified from that level, so.
Uh-huh.
They aren't used primarily for temporary housing, though. We've talked about that. They're often used for over 30-day rentals. Mine are used, as far as IRS tax code, more long-term than short-term.
Right, but there's no definition for what defines what's temporary and what's not, and that's part of the conversation
Yeah,
that we're
there's
having
no
now.
definition of how long someone can rent and be considered a long-term rental either. There's no definition of rental as a residential use in our code. Any
Right.
rental.
Right, and I think that it's something that we need to define so that we have clarity on what is allowed and is not allowed. I am fully acknowledging that there's a lack of definition here.
I have a question. What about HOAs? Where do they fit in?
Many HOAs already have prohibition of certain types of things. It could be the home occupancy business. It could be, I know the 1HA to the west, having dealt with that issue with some citizens, they were doing short-term rentals, and that was terminated, basically. The HAA said they wouldn't allow it, and they tried to come in and get some different permits to do some of the work. So there have been some court cases in other jurisdictions, not in our jurisdictions, that said HOAs may not have that power.
I see, so that's up in the air. Laura, do you have a comment?
I have seen a recent case in the Colorado Court of Appeals, I think it was August 2015, where they ruled that it's not right to say that a transient nature of a dwelling timeframe makes it either commercial or business or not a residential use.
That
Right,
seems
and,
vague. What does that
I would-
mean?
Well, people have been trying to say you can't have a short-term rental in a neighborhood because that's a business or a commercial use and you can't do it. And those people have been going to court over it, saying,
I
yes,
see.
that is a residential use, and the courts have been agreeing.
Oh,
Right, and I
okay.
would say that that's absolutely true, and that's because our zoning lacks a specific definition, and that the courts will say there's no definition here for what residential is, or what qualifies as a business operation for, duration of stay, and I think that's something that we need to define.
They actually are saying residential is defined as a dwelling, and the amount of time that you're dwelling doesn't have any impact on whether it's dwelling.
Our land use code has no definition for what residential is.
No, I'm talking about what the Colorado Court of Appeals came to when the decision came to them.
Okay, I assume that the city collects certain state and local and maybe a lodging tax. Do we know how many of these, let's just say 400 units are paying those taxes? Do they have to have a permit? If I wanted to rent rooms in my house, would I have to come down and get a permit, or can I just do it?
Well, unfortunately, you can just do it, but you shouldn't.
Okay.
You should acquire a sales tax license and pay the lodging tax on top of that. And at last count, and as we've been having this conversation, the number has increased. We are still just below 100. I think at last look, there were about 94 folks that had a sales and lodging tax license and were remitting tax.
Okay, so we can assume approximately 200 or 300 people are doing this and not paying tax. Is that a fair assumption?
We certainly know there's more than 94 properties doing this particular activity, so a fair assessment would be everyone's not paying their fair share of tax.
Okay. Laura?
I think we figured out, didn't we, that we're at about 75% compliance with tax on VRBO. Airbnb has way less tax compliance.
Mm-hmm.
But I know we've argued about this a little bit before. There are, the rule is that you have to have a license if you intend to rent. So if you place an ad on one of these websites, you should have a license before you place the ad. And even if you never rent for one day and you never make any money, you should have a license and be filing a zero tax return. And I think there's quite a few people out there who don't know that. Like, I'm just going to place an ad on Airbnb for this bedroom that I have. Rent's a little bit more than I'd like, and they never get a bite. They forget they did it. It's still there. They should have a license, so they're considered non-compliant. But I think even if they were compliant, they probably wouldn't. There is some number out there that would not increase tax revenue, and then there's obviously some that would.
I don't disagree with that, and I don't think I've ever argued with you about that. I argue more that I've heard people say that, well, gee, many Airbnb folks or VRBO folks don't really know that they're supposed to collect sales tax and lodging tax, which unless those people have never stayed in a hotel or motel in the United States or somewhere else in the world, I don't believe that, because everyone's fairly used to sales tax and a lodging tax and knowing it's going to be another 8 to 12 or 15% depending where you are. And folks who are saying they're not aware that they should do that must not read the papers, must not read stuff online, must not look at the rules of the two sites, what they tell you to do. So one of the ways to do that, we're looking at, along with other Colorado municipalities, and it could be counties too, is to work with Airbnb and VRBOs to see if we could create a Colorado platform that they can feed into, so that actually the owners of the property wouldn't have to remit the tax. It would be done automatically based on each jurisdiction's rules, which then make it really easy, and then everyone would be complying with the law who uses sites like that.
Well, one of the things that Laura said is that no money takes exchange because it all goes through Airbnb and VRBO. So in that sense, they really should be the ones who are collecting it, or not.
No money, I meant no money's exchanged at the property.
Right.
People have the option to have Airbnb or VRBO collect the money for them, or they can collect it themselves. And eventually it ends up in the homeowner's bank account, and then the homeowner remits the taxes.
I see.
It'd be awesome if VRBO or Airbnb would collect the taxes, but they aren't there yet. That would be a nice thing, and I think anything that makes following the rules easier is a good thing. The city of Fort Collins just last year did an online tax remittance form, and I love it. It saves me a ton of time. It calculates it for me, and I can pay online. So anything that makes it easier for us to comply with regulations and taxation is a good thing.
Okay, Ginny?
I was just going to add that, one, we haven't as a city to this point done a big education push out there, since we don't know where it's going to go, but that is certainly in our tool bag to do more of that and promote and advertise and let people know. We are in talks with Airbnb and have exchanged the legal forms for that platform to collect and possibly remit sales tax for folks. And then slowly making inroads with VRBO. While I don't think they will do that now, they are willing to at least send communications to hosts within our area. So, as we start to delve in here, we make some progress and build those relationships, I think.
I was just going to say, I started looking into what the penalties are for not being compliant, because a lot of people have said we need stiffer penalties, and then maybe people would be more compliant. And actually, in our tax code, if you collect money and don't have the proper license, there's a fine up to $2,650 and 180 days in jail. So I think if the city would try to use some of that, there'd be a lot of resources. I mean, maybe it'd be hard to collect the $2,650, but there would be a lot of resources if we find people that much and they knew that they were going to get in that much trouble for not having their license.
As I know, our moderator knows, that's simply what the misdemeanor maximums are, the 180 days in jail. We recently changed used to be 1,000, and now it went up to 2,650, as recommended by Judge Elaine, the municipal judge. Rarely ever, I don't know, very few times anybody goes to jail. I don't know if any case ever for tax stuff for the city. And the fines are used more, actually, one of the great examples, the fines are used very effectively on the U+2 enforcement, because someone may get a $1,000 fine, but the judge will hold half of it or 3/4 of it in abeyance. And if you get a second violation, then you win twice. So it's used as a tool for encouraging correct behavior versus just a really stiff thing to just throw at folks. It's giving her latitude to be able to deal with the issues.
Okay, Eric, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so we started out the question here asking what is required to do one of these, short-term rentals. And generally speaking, it's that you have to get a sales tax license and a lodging tax license and collect those things. And I just wanted to specifically note the discrepancies there between what our tax code is, our municipal code is, and our land use code, and the real need that we need to update things and make clear definitions, because if people are collecting lodging taxes, it seems not sensical that they shouldn't be considered lodging. I mean, I'm not saying that it's right that they should be or shouldn't be. It's just a point that I want to highlight, that our definitions are clearly lacking in what these are and where they fit in our city.
Okay. Now, the council is considering some changes. You've worked on it, I think, a lot, Ginny. Can you tell us some of the things that they're considering, and then Gerry can tell us some others?
Right. Well, could sound surprising to council, because we've been off busy doing our policy formation and work You'll probably promote our open house, which is happening next week. So in having these conversations and looking at other communities, staff is slowly honing in on some different options and parameters of what a regulatory scheme could look like. And as we look at other communities, it's everything from adopting existing zoning and only allowing in certain zones. It's from just a registration process. I mean, we can be more lenient or we can be more restrictive. And there are a variety of aspects that can become part of that, whether it's provide a local contact, provide proof of insurance, make sure you have a certain amount of off-street parking. I can look at others, but I think there's a wide variety, limiting the concentration, whether by census tract or by block or by number. There are numerous examples out there, and I think, as always, we need to find the right fit for our community. We can't just take something from another community and plop it down here. We need to massage it and work it and find out what's going to be best.
Jerry, do you want to add to any of that?
Not add, but use my Uber analogy. So for me to drive for Uber, I had to provide them who I was, the driver's license, et cetera, which also has my address, et cetera. I had to go through some sort of health check that I could not, die or cause problems while driving, and that I had to go someplace and get my car inspected to show that it met their safety standards.
Okay.
So that's what I had to do to be able to do a simple thing like that using a platform in the same way. And I think some things like that, that's what I would like to look. I can't say what council's going to do, but I think some reasonable requirements where you give people a surety of the good that they're receiving. And the argument would be, well, you're not doing that for long-term rentals. I have no problems for looking at it for long-term rentals are rentals to me, and they should abide by the standards we have. And we have a code, but it's only done on complaint basis. So think about that. That's putting a lot of onus on who's ever in it, which may not be to their advantage to complain while you're in a structure, especially a longer-term rental, and that it's been shown over the years it hasn't been effective. When we've used more active enforcement on U+2, it's been far more effective. So that's something that I think we should be considering.
Okay. What about in the audience? Are there any questions in the audience?
So my name is Michelle Hafley, and I live in one of the areas that has some dots in it. And as a diligent homeowner, I know what my zoning permits and what it doesn't permit. So what I have a two-part question, and I think this is probably for Ginny. Is there any place where I can go online and find out what the locations are for any entity that is currently paying or has a lodging tax license?
So we have provided that information. It's certainly public. I don't know that it's available online.
So who would I contact to find out which of those particular dots there might be actually paying lodging taxes to the city?
It would be the sales tax office, and I can
And if I
send you
call,
that.
I can ask?
Mhm.
Okay. So my second question then is, suppose that I do go and I find out that those two dots that are right there in my neighborhood in the NCL zone, which currently does not permit lodging, if I find that those two dots, either one or both, are actually remitting lodging tax to the city, what will the city do to reconcile that conflict between the zoning, which does not permit lodging, and the clearly an active lodging business? How will the city reconcile that currently without doing any kind of other regulation or study or any other analysis of this situation? It looks to me like, looking at that map, that there are some clear current zoning violations going on, and how will the city rectify those?
So outside of this process, which is what you're saying, what will we do today? I can't say for certain. I think if you contacted our zoning department, they would have a conversation and possibly get in touch with those homeowners. But again, I can't say with any certainty.
So what would happen then if the zoning department determined that a lodging business in a zone that doesn't permit lodging was actually operating as an illegal in violation of zoning? How would the city then proceed?
And again, I don't know procedurally. I do know of at least one short-term rental that has been shut down based on a zoning complaint. And I don't know the process that under which that occurred.
So to your point, Michelle, obviously in the longer run here, where we're trying to head to is to know and have that sales tax, lodging tax, registration, part of that process should be looking, which they're not there, it's not what's happening right now, but looking at the zones and whatever rules we come up with to make sure it makes sense. And if it doesn't make, and I can say the same thing, there's a property within a block of where I live. I know it's not on that map, but it's obviously in the same zone. That's what we need to look at. And then, the differential to me, and again, I'm just speaking for myself, I think there's a big difference between the room or so that's being rented and an entire property being rented. And that's another one we'll be taking a look at. When I've heard concerns from council or citizens, if it's more around properties that can be rented for many people or have effects on them like that versus, this is the typical picture you see is the seniors, which Barbara and I qualify for now, renting out a room to somebody, which usually isn't the big issue that's going to be happening in the neighborhood.
It's when it's a whole house with lots of parties. Is that what you're saying?
A whole house that may, I'm not saying any, I mean, many of the rent don't have that. I'm not again, I'm making sure that, Laura and others, I'm not accusing everybody who does this, but yes, that has been some of the concerns that people have. Another one deals with, we have a U+2, but in some of these properties, they have more people staying than what the U+2 rules are, right? Mm-hmm. So people are wondering how come you enforce that on long-term rentals and you're not enforcing it on short-term rentals? Well, obviously, part of the problem is you don't have time to enforce it.
Can I speak? for a
Sure,
minute?
of course.
So in the city land use definitions, the definition of a lodging establishment is a building intended and used for occupancy as a temporary abode for individuals who are lodged with or without meals in which there are 5 or more guest rooms. So the majority of the places that we have less than 5 rooms, and those rooms aren't rented out to individuals who are all different. And the U+2 law applies to rentals over 30 days, so it technically doesn't apply to under 30 days, but most of us, if we rent a place, rent it to a family. So we're not renting it to like a team of rugby players. We're renting to a grandma coming to visit her newborn grandkid most of the time. It's stuff like that. So, and I also wanted to bring up another lawsuit that happened over this issue. It said the actual renting of the cabin and any financial transactions associated thereof occur off-site. The Slabbies do not solicit rents on-site, do it through the internet where potential tenants can view the premises without going there. While occupying the cabin, the tenants must cook and clean for themselves and they do not receive any services. Although the Slabbies remit lodging tax, which is payable by persons engaging in a business of renting or furnishing any room or rooms, lodging, or accommodations to transient in any, and then ... It doesn't go on from there. It says the fact that fact does not detract from the conclusion that no commercial activity takes place on the premises.
And all those reasons are why we're trying to align various definitions, take a look at them and see how they interact. Again, the code is cobbled together over time. This particular issue of short-term rentals is illustrated, as well as some of the long-term rental issues, as to why we need to take a comprehensive look and try to put something together that works on both sides, the sales tax side, the land use side, the business side, et cetera. So that's why and I think actually the conversation this evening has illustrated why we need to do that.
Right.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Eric.
I was going to say the exact same thing that Jerry said, is I think that's a perfect illustrator, again, pointing out the discrepancy between our municipal code and the taxation and what our land use code says. They're literally in conflict with each other. So I think that, as Jerry said, we have to take a look at this and define what these things are more clearly and make it so that things match up so that it works.
Very good. Any other comments? Yes.
I'd like for it to work for everybody too. I like to keep my neighbors happy, and I want this to be something that's not disruptive to neighborhoods and not portrayed as the evil, ugly stepchild. I think it has a valuable place in our society, and I want to try to find ways to make it work for those who live around it.
Great. Go ahead.
And I couldn't agree more. I think that's what we're trying to head to, that it has benefits, especially, university town. We have lots of people coming and going, whether they're staying for a few days or staying for months, who use these types of facilities. We have graduations happening, whether they're high school or whether they're college, that folks use these. We have folks coming for festivals. So all those make sense. It's just we want to be transparent about what's happening, everyone to know the rules, and everyone to know what's going to work for the overall good of the city.
Okay, wonderful. Anybody else want to make a summary statement? I think you kind of have. What about Eric? Do you have anything you want to say?
No, I mean, I generally would say that I pretty much agree with Jerry, and especially with the last point, that we have to do what's best for our city, and that's including protecting what we need to protect. So I think that these things have a place, but I think that we also have places that we need to protect and preserve. So
Right.
I think that's an issue that we need to consider when we're looking at this.
Laura?
I think with any new regulations that it seems reasonable. Maybe I heard from Ginny that they were thinking of a cap of the number of properties that a person or an entity could own. That seems like a reasonable thing to put into place so that they don't overtake any neighborhoods, and so that there's not the fear that a big corporation is going to come in and run a lot of them. I kind of agree with that as maybe a way to go for a regulation. And I also am not opposed to the safety inspections. I really don't care because my places are all up to code. It just seems like a lot that would require a lot of extra resources from the city, but I'm willing to see that in a regulation.
My name is Lynette Johnston, and I am a real estate broker with a local property management company. And we also do these types of rentals, but we do them for 30 days or more only to be in compliance with taxation laws and everything. I guess my question to Eric, okay, I was going to say Eric or Aaron, I wasn't quite sure, is that you seem to have a negative point of view. Why is that? Like, what is the bottom line for you? What is wrong with these in your mind?
For rentals that are less than 30 days?
Yes.
So there's generally 2 points. One is I think that according to the map that we've got here is that we need to protect the areas that are already designated for protection, our residential neighborhoods, especially
Protect
the
them
area
from what, though, is what I'm asking.
from erosion, from disappearing because of all these properties turning into short-term rentals. And secondarily, I think that, the transient nature in particular of things that are less than 30 days is disruptive. It's disruptive to.
Are you aware that they're also very expensive to rent out and that they typically do not rent to a transient type of person?
I didn't mean transient by the type of person, I meant transient in their short duration.
Hi, I'm Lisa Eaton. I have a question for Laura. Can you give numbers, at least regarding VRBO, as far as the growth rate in the past 5 years? How many were on about 5 years ago and how many are on right now?
I don't actually remember, but it has.
I remember for Boulder at least.
From 25 to 131 in the last 5 years. So it
Yeah.
hasn't gone like ballistic.
In Boulder,
Crazy.
they had, I think, 200 in 2005, and now they have over 1,500.
And we have to think about how many of them are actually being rented and how many are just advertisements. I always like to make that distinction. There's an ad and then there's an actual rental. They aren't the same thing, especially on Airbnb where you can rent for free.
Okay, I think we've covered the subject, unless you would like to make a final comment, Jenny?
I will just make a final comment that if anyone is out there or watching prior to next week, we will have a public open house Thursday, February 4th from 5:30 to 7 p.m. in the community room at 215 North Mason.
Okay, so if you're interested in finding out more about this subject, that's the place to be. Thank you for our panel and to our viewing and studio audiences. We're delighted that you came, asked some questions, and I think we all learned something. Mainly that the city has some work to do. So good luck, Jerry and council. The video is available at the League of Women Voters website, which is www.lwv-larimercounty.org. Thanks again for tuning in and coming.